everyone. Hopefully, we're gonna start strong. I'm gonna be talking today about my great-grandfather, Jacob Roy Kaler, and the more I learned about him through this project, the less he kind of seemed like a real person and just more of a tall tale instead. So he was born in 1887 in Helena, Montana, to Jacob and Julia Doyle Kaler. We then don't know the next 30 years of his life. We found a census in 1900 that shows that at the age of 13, he still lived in Helena, Montana. And we also have these really cool pieces of writing in autograph books, which for those of you guys who don't know, autograph books are kind of like yearbook diaries where you give them to your friends and they'd write little notes. And the ones we have were all romantic, not from his wife. So I have a couple of writings from 3 different women in here that I'm going to share. The first one's from 1904. He would have been 17 at the time, from a girl named Maud. And she says, when you are married and have a kid on your knee and don't know what to name it after me. Yeah, we don't know what happens to Maud, but we have some varieties. And then the second one we have is from Blanche, and this one's from a song. We don't have a date from when she wrote it, but the song is from 1914. However, it's on the next page from the 1904 one, so a little bit out of order. However, the quote goes, our eyes have met, our lips not yet, but oh, you kid, I'll get you yet. This comes from the song, Everybody Loves My Girl. And then the last one is special because she has her own book of writings of pages that kind of start with a dear Roy and go on to my dear friend. So we know that they were a lot closer. This would have been in 1910 when he was 23 years of age, from a girl named Annie. And hers says, when in a far and distant land, you see the writing of my hand, and if my face you do not see, then dear Roy, remember me. And so part of why I love these is because we didn't find these autograph books with my great-grandfather's stuff. We found them with my great-grandmother's stuff. So I personally like to believe that she kept them to show that she won, that all of these women wanted her man, but she got him. So anyways, the first real piece of like physical documentation we have is his draft card into the Great War. And he was drafted into the Air Corps. He served from 1918 to 1919. He never went across seas to Europe. And you guys might be thinking with the Air Corps, planes. But no, this was a time where he served in the 75th Balloon Company. So he worked with blimps. Here's a photo of him with some members of his battalion. He's on the far right for you guys. And we also have his draft card. A story that we have from him is, like I said, he didn't go overseas, but he did training, and he trained with a lot of farmers who, according to him, didn't know their left from their right. So instead, what they would do is they tied a piece of straw to one shoe and a piece of hay to the other, and they would march straw, hay, instead of left, right, left, right. And just a little bit of context about the school he went to, the Omaha Balloon School in Nebraska. It opened from 1908 to 1913. It shut down and then reopened right before the U.S. went into the Great War from 1916 and then closed with the ending of the war in 1919. And it sent 35 balloon companies to Europe. Here's a picture of one of the balloons that they would have been using. They also used an Italian style and a French style. I just wanted you guys to be able to really focus on the one that he might have primarily been using. But after the Great War, the next piece of information we have from him is his homestead applications. And he submitted, I think it was 4 different homestead applications. One was his father on behalf of him. And what this was, it was the Homestead Act of 1862 allowed for people to get money and prove that they had been improving said land. And he would have filed under the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which primarily involved Montana. He had a couple different year proofs of 3 and 5 to show that he was improving the land. And you might be wondering what he did on said land. And he did two different things. By day, he was a rancher. So first of all, he married in 1925 to my grandmother, or great-grandmother, sorry, Alma Althea. And we don't actually know her legal name. We know that in some documents it's Alma, in some documents it's Althea. Sometimes she has the name Weston in there. It's different on her children's birth certificates. So there's no really consistency in it. But they got married in 1925 on the ranch. And there he was a cattle and a horse rancher. If you can look at the top left corner, we have a copyright for a brand that he used to like brand his livestock. One story that we have from him is that we know he hated sheep herders. And that's because if sheep and cow graze on the same land, sheep graze closer to the root of the grass, which means that the cows would starve. So we know that he would light wagons full of hay on fire and roll them down the hill to sheep farmers' encampments to get them to leave the area. So yeah, and then we also have a picture of him with other ranchers. This is him right here. But as you guys might have noticed, there are two people scratched out in the photo. One of them very clearly close because he has his arm around my great-grandfather. Sadly, we don't know why they're scratched out. We don't know who they are, but we know that there was some sort of grudge or bad blood that happened after the said photo was taken. Now, I told you guys his day job, but by night, he was a moonshine runner, and so he, so the tall tale. So he owned a whiskey still in Montana. Prohibition started in 1918, so he had a little bit more time to run moonshine. And my great-grandmother always said that he was never caught. However, we know that's not true because we have a newspaper of him getting arrested. And so she always said he was very careful. In his homestead, he was on top of the hill, so he had planned it to where if authorities were coming up the hill, he'd be able to see them ahead of time. Still, he was caught one day with a keg in his Model T, and he was pulled over, arrested, and then in court, they had a little vial of his moonshine, and when they tried to light it, it didn't light, so he got off. And there could be multiple different reasons. Maybe his moonshine wasn't actually that alcoholic or good. My theory, though, is that he was able to pay somebody off to switch the vials. And the only reason I have this theory is because he always told his family that the best time to run moonshine was when the legislature came to town, because he was in the state's capital. So that's always when he earned the most money. Now I've talked about his life. I will talk about his family a little bit. Again, he was married in 1925, and he had 5 children when in Montana. And my grandfather was not one of them. Yes, he then moving out to Washington. He then moved out to Washington in 1934. All of his children in Montana were born from 1927 to 1933. And the reason they moved out to Washington was on behalf of my great-grandmother, who firmly believed that she didn't want to spend any more winters snowed in with 5 little children. So then we have a little bit of a gap. 14 years later, they have my grandfather. And at the time, my great-grandmother would have been 40 and he would have been 60. So we have limited amounts of stories of my great-grandfather just because there's such a big age gap between him and his son. And this photo is how my grandfather recognized them as people just older. Going through the photographs of them younger, he's like, I don't recognize these people as well. But once in Washington, he had a small self-sustaining farm. he, I think, applied for another homestead out in Port Angeles. And he had just a small logging business that he did on his own land. And we have another copyright and like a physical brand that they would put into the logs. So yeah, he died at the age of 79 in 1967. And something cool that I think that I'll end on is that he was able to see the Wright brothers exhibition as a kid. And then he was in the balloon corps. And by the time he died, he had also seen the moon landing. So just a crazy amount of like anyways, this is my bibliography. I won't go through it for time, but thank you guys so much.
Alrighty. Hello, everybody. How y'all doing today? Good. Glad to hear that. Thank you all for coming out this way. Really appreciate y'all. So my name is Zach Hardwick, like mentioned, and this is my granddad. This is Charles Simmons Warfield Jr. We all call him Chuck, though. I was really close with him, and I got to learn a lot of stories before he eventually passed in 2015. But he wrote down a lot and told me a lot of great stuff. So let's dive right in. All righty. Let me go over just some 4 different sections right here for you. I have his earlier life, his Korean War, his later life, and then I'm going to go over some sources for that. So let's do it. Cool. His early life. He was born in 1930 to Charles Warfield Senior and Eula Stevenson. Charles Warfield Senior actually was a shipbuilder. He built giant steel vessels for a living. That was his occupation. And Eula Stevenson was a stay-at-home mother. There's a little picture of him right there, a little suit, a little salute like that. And then he was born in Los Angeles, but he was raised in Glendale, California, so just a little bit north of here, which is quite cool. Then he was actually born into the Great Depression as well, as being an only child. So it didn't seem like the depression was too hard on them, but they seemed to manage quite well. And then just remember, he told me a story once. He was walking through a park one day, and he was just strolling about, picking rocks and stuff like that, when he heard about the Pearl Harbor bombings. So that was kind of shook his world a little bit, and we didn't really realize that something like that could happen to the United States. So that was definitely shocking for him. Moving on here to his adolescent years. During this time, his parents actually would end up getting a divorce, which kind of changed his outlook on life a little bit more as well. That's him. I graduated high school, and during this time as well, he moved to the Bay Area, which is Marin County, over in Kentfield. So yeah, and then during this time as well, he kind of gets into like this volunteer, like he really wants to make a difference, not only for himself but for others. During this time, he enlisted as a little handyman around the Marin County Fire Department, where he'd just be like on the floor helping out all the firefighters as well. And during this time, he also became a Boy Scout, which he's pictured up there, second to the right. That's my grandpa. But yeah, he also loved to work with his hands a lot. He was very crafty, and he always liked to build things. He would build boats as well, like his father. And he'd also like build little. He was very good with carpentry, so he'd build little boxes and whatnot for himself as well. So shifting over here during, as well as during this time, excuse me, he'd like to be enlisted in the Merchant Marines Corps. So in 1949, he actually, before the Korean War, spent an entire 11-month branch in the Merchant Marines, where he got to go all over the world. He went to Japan, he went to the Persian Gulf. He actually, from the Bay Area, he went all the way across to Japan, down around to the UK, and then back around. So he basically got to see the entire world in 11 months, and he wrote a lot about it. One of my primary sources I am using is actually about his time in the Merchant Marine Corps. He wrote a lot about it, and he has some really great stories to tell, which is really neat. And then going on to the Korean War here, let's jump right in. He was 1st Cavalry Division. He was served as a mailman, which is interesting because I thought like, oh, mailman, that's kind of boring, you know. But then doing some research actually, and when he told me, he was actually in a cavalry, sorry, not cavalry division, artillery division. So he was literally a mailman delivering artillery shells, which is just quite interesting. Like, oh, that's not as boring, but I mean, yeah. So he was a mailman, but really he was the 77th Artillery Division in Korea. The Korean War was kind of hard on him. He didn't really like to tongue twister. Didn't like to talk a lot about the Korean War, but what he did talk about, said it was very cold and it was very noisy. So, I mean, what you expect, but yeah, he spent 4 years in the military as an army man and for the 1st Cavalry Division. This picture here actually is him with the 38th parallel, which is really interesting. And then the other picture of him is when he enlisted. So during this time, he got to know a lot of friends. There's a picture of him up there. I don't really know if that's Vanguard appropriate because there is some, yeah, there's a picture of him up there. And then, till this day, or till the day he passed, he hated camping. He hated being in a tent in the cold. So he would always talk about how much he despised camping. But as well as all the artillery explosions, really hard on his hearing. So he got hearing aids at a very young age due to that fact. Here's a story of his return. Upon his return, he showed up to Hawaii on Oahu. Thank you. He showed up to Oahu, and on Oahu, he was wearing this thick layered jacket from the cold. He landed in Oahu, just took off his shirt, took off his jacket, ran to the beach, where he soaked some rays finally. So yeah. And then moving on here, it was later life. So he returned in that's a typo, sorry, 1954, not 44. I didn't catch that at the time. But I returned in 54, and then he attended Ring College. During this time as well, he worked as a clerk at a gas station and also as a mailman. So it's during this time, he also actually met his wife, pictured right there, which is Sandra Payton. They met at an accounting class at Ring College. That's where they would meet, and then 1 year later they get married, and they were married for 60 years. So quite a long time. But during this time as well, Charles would also attend San Francisco State University, where he would get his bachelor's degree as well as a master's. And during this time too, he became a family man. His firstborn right there, Ron, or I call him Ronnie, but it said this is family. During this time as well, he also wanted to focus more on his academic, and he wanted to be a teacher. So he became a teacher for the Terra Linda School District. And during this time, he became a teacher, followed by an eventual principal. And he stayed in this gig until he retired. So for about 30 to 35 years, he was the principal. He loved being a principal. He loved talking to kids and kind of getting to know them. Took a lot of pride in his work as well. And then everyone describes him as a workaholic. So he very much liked to work, and he was very much in his business, and he took it very seriously, and he was very professional about it. But so he had 4 kids. So my aunts and uncles, Ronnie, Eddie, Nancy, and my mom Jennifer. And then they lived in Nevada, California, which is also in the Bay Area. I don't really expect you to know that, but yeah. Then he also loved to just work with his hands, to continue to build a lot and continue to seek out carpentry. And after he retired, actually, he became very much into carpentry, building many of the just things around our house and drawers, dressers, stuff like that, bed frames. That's how he would unwind after a long day's work, as well as gardening. He loved to garden as well, and he took a lot of pride in his garden and his fruits and vegetables. Always gave us banana bread, stuff like that, and yeah, cucumber bread. But yeah, so he left quite a legacy behind. The picture below is a few of us, not the whole entire family, but so he had 4 kids. He had, I believe, 16 grandkids, and as of last Friday, 28 great-grandkids, and the legacy keeps continuing. So I look up to him personally. He's a great role model for me, and yeah. And going over just a little literary review of what my sources are and what they comprise of. Research method, not boring stuff. So I basically compiled a lot of my oral history from my grandma and my aunts and uncles, because I can't really directly talk to my grandpa anymore. But so I got some good stuff from there. I interviewed them a couple weeks ago, and just kind of helped piece together a lot of the gray areas in his life, because he didn't talk a lot about the war, like I mentioned earlier. So a lot of that was kind of hard to get a lot of dates and times. I used a lot of pictures as well, because they always had dates in the back, which were very helpful for me to kind of comprise that. I'm using primary stories as well. I'll be looking at stories that he had written himself, like his time in the Marines. He wrote about a 5-page just kind of paper about his journeys, which would be really helpful for me. And as well as secondary sources, I'll be looking at just like external books and primary journals, stuff like that, that will kind of help figure out the whole narrative of not only him, but the events that he was a part of as well, which kind of helped shape him in the long run. But that is basically all I have for y'all. Thank you very much. Oh. All right, thank you everyone for coming. I'm David Garcia, and first I want to say thanks especially to the staff at Vanguard. We have an awesome department here, very helpful, and I also want to say special thanks to my family for coming. You might recognize this handsome man, my grandfather, and then my brother and parents, and my grandma, of course. And so I'm going to be talking about his life. That is what my project's about. I've learned about this my entire life, so it's nice to finally accumulate it in one paper. So what we're going to talk about today in the same format that my paper will be in is his immigration story, his legacy, and his works cited, with subpoints as well. So my thesis is going to be Joaquin Garcia blazed the trails for his family through his ambitious life story and left a legacy for generations to remember. So I'm harping on the ambitious side of his life that led him to where he is today, and then also the legacy that you see here. So this gives you a little teaser of what's coming, the seminary. So life before the seminary, he was born in 1938, the oldest of 14 children. And, on a small ranch, and you see the picture here, it says, he documented super well, by the way, a lot of this information is from him. He documented that 13 of the siblings were born in that house. He was born at his grandfather's. The point to cover is going to be his birth, in 1938, on the ranch life, and then his first memories and the family. And his first memory I find really fun. His first memory is actually being carried home from a chapel where he saw a depiction of the Virgin, and he was being carried home, I think, by his father, and taken home and put to bed. What a nice first image, right? First memory. My cousin's first memory is stubbing her toe. So what a contrast, right? And I mean, the fact that he documented this, it's amazing. So, and then also the life on the ranch, him being the oldest, and his father would go to the United States in 1950 to start working and bring money home. He became a dad basically, in his teenage years, had to take care of the house, and thankfully he had a very tough mom who, give or take, she was very hard, but also that kept him alive. So, the poor poverty life, times where the mom was crying and he had to go manage to find some money for food, for beans and milk and things like that they need. So the poor life that he talks about it's just something to behold for sure. It's something that so many of us take for granted. And also his ambition. Early on, he decided that he wanted to move up in the world, he decided this is not just for him. He doesn't want to just stay on the ranch his whole life. He knew about places like Mexico City in the United States, and he wanted to see them. So he found his way into the seminary, which is where he received his education and learned multiple languages, Latin, French, English, Spanish, and also about his faith life. This is I know the least about his seminary experience, which makes sense. It's also the shortest time. He was in there for 8 years, and his childhood was longer than that. And so that's the time after the seminary, of course. But for 8 years, he was in the seminary. The last 2 he spent discerning whether it was for him or not. After that time, he shared with one of his friends at the seminary that he was like, it's not for me. I don't think this is my vocation, and decided it wasn't for him. And his friend was like, but you, Joaquin, you out of everyone? He's like, if anyone was going to be a priest, it was going to be you. Like, he's known as like the saint among them, right? How are the rest of them going to pull it off? So, just to show you a little bit about how he is, many people have referred to him as like a saint. And his faith life, he learned a lot in that time. And this was also around the time of Vatican II in the 60s. So changing time for the Catholic Church. Post-seminary, now we're looking into 65 is when he left. So onwards from there, his first work when he came to the United States, through his dad, worked with him and went into the north and Reading and things like that. And there's a story that he shared with me just the other day. I'll share. I don't know how much he likes this story, but he was he had his tourist visa and everything, but then it expired, right? But he was still working in the United States. And so at one point, immigration came at like 7 in the morning. He was there with his brother and a few other undocumented workers. And, they came in and he was like, oh, I'll get my papers. Let me just go to the bathroom, punch the glass in the window, jump through the window, right into the hills. They said he was like a rabbit. So, yeah. So, that's crazy stories like that, all the way up in Redding area of California. Eventually he would come down to Orange, where I live and where he lives. He gained his citizenship also. That's another fun story. But about when his friend was like, oh, we can help you get citizenship. All you have to do is just pay my girlfriend and she'll marry you. And so he was like, okay, I guess, this is for my future. But then he felt so terrible about it, went to the church to go get an annulment, but they were like, it's not through the church. It's not a valid marriage in the first place. So no need to worry, just confession and go get that handled with the courts. But he felt so terrible after it. And so and this is the same man that people call a saint, so it's the contrast, I guess, right? You can't judge a person, I guess. And so, but yeah, hard worker, he married my grandma, Susan Garcia now. She was a maiden name, Cuvion. Then they had my dad, David Garcia. I'm a junior. And so I had him, and that was a handful. My goodness, my dad, he was the kind of youngster to have a semi truck for a toy, metal one, pour gasoline in the back and light it on fire. Right? They had their hands full with him. And then they adopted my aunt from Mexico. And so they brought her back and, raised her as well. He also worked at Orange Unified School District for quite a long time as the locksmith. And he would tell me frequently, because I went to El Medina, same with my brother. My dad went to Orange, my mom went to Villa Park. So we're very familiar with Orange Unified School District. And he would tell me all the time, oh, see all these locks? I rekeyed all of them. And on Fred Kelly Stadium, the main stadium where all the teams go to play, he's like, yeah, that fence used to have a chain with a chain link lock around it, just like a regular one that you would clamp onto a chain. But then because of him, they put an actual lock on there and all the other things. He showed me his awards that he's received. And so I'm very lucky. He has all this documentation. I just can't harp on that enough. It's insane, really, to me. Speaking of which, the documentation you can see here, he wrote genealogies and took pictures of all the family members. That's as you see here, my great grandparents. 3 greats. That's in Mexico, it's unheard of. That's insane, right? So, I'm like, for a poor family, it makes you wonder how poor were we really? Who knows? But also the genealogy, we have a massive family. This is not nearly everyone. This is, just his parents and then working its way down. So it's a very long list, and that was completed in 2009. So it's much bigger since. The oldest of 14 children, and almost all of them had kids. So there's a lot of people going around, right? So it's a pretty large family, and that's part of his legacy that he leaves. Part of the legacy you see is me right here sharing this. I hope this can be somewhat of a gift to my grandfather to see that, after all of his hard work, that here I am talking about it, appreciating it, for him to be here today. Also the legacy he left at Orange Unified School District. There's times where I run into people left and right, and they're like, oh, Don Joaquin, hey, my goodness, like the stories that they could tell, helping out the church, and I'm like, people are like, I think I know your grandpa. So it's amazing. So many people all these memories about his life that they like to share. And then also the faith life. I'm very involved in my church. And I have to say, of course, some of it is due to my grandfather, that one of the memories he loved to share all the time is one of the first time I actually remember going to church. He was pretty much the only one who would take me. And there was a time where I pointed up to Jesus on the cross and I'm like, hey, who killed that guy? He loved that story, right? And he just laughed. He's like, well, that's Jesus, right? So stories like that just make a lasting impact, right? And the legacy continues on for future generations. I was talking to my cousin last night, actually, telling her about this presentation I'm going to give, and she's all into history now. So just within one conversation, she's like, wow, it's so cool, actually. So I'm very fortunate to have this documentation. Now onto the source work. Speaking about it, I brought the main book that I'm using that he wrote himself. This is 40 pages worth of just goodness right here. My goodness. Like shared his first memories, when his dad went to, and it's all in Spanish too. And I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I can read a good amount of it, thankfully. And so I've been helping with my dad and, the house and things like that. You've seen pictures on previous slides, like the house you see here growing up on the ranch. So I'm very, very fortunate to have this. He wrote this in his time in the seminary, his last year.
And he actually wrote the dates when he started and ended. Who does that, right? When you start and write ending, I mean, you won't even find that for most history books and things like that, so it's amazing. And then this copy in particular, he expanded upon it and gave it to my dad in 2019, but he finished it in 2016. So this manuscript was written from then. And it's his life during the seminary, before, after, so it's so much information. Another source I'm using is oral history, of course. I mean, whenever we go to eat, I'm basically just interrogating this guy for information left and right. And my brother, same thing with him. We just love learning more about it. You can't get enough. And so I'm also going to supplement it with some sources about the Cristero War and immigration sources as well, because the Cristero War did affect his time, because it was hard for his documentation and for education to come over to the United States because the government still had some hard feelings against the church in that time. And then I believe it's his grandfather, one of them, who participated in the Cristero War. So those documents come up that it's important for the story. But it's also about immigration into the United States. You know, of course, him being an immigrant, that's important as well to share. So those are some extra sources that I've compiled to complete this. And so, yeah, I'm very fortunate to have my grandfather with such documentation. Like, how fortunate am I? I mean, my dad, when he was reading this, I saw him cry one time. My dad's not a baby, so to speak, I guess, right? And so, and me reading it the other day, I can see why. Just reading it, I'm like, wow, it's something, I'm sure we're crying for different reasons, but, you know, it's just amazing. It's like, how grateful am I to have my grandpa and my grandma as well, and all the work that they've done for my family to be here. And so I'm very grateful to end this time at Vanguard this year and conclude with their story. And it's somewhat of a beginning, you know, coming full circle, because when I came into this, they're like, why do you want to be a history major? Part of it was because him, all the stories that he's told me growing up, same thing for my dad, you know, it leaves a large impact on your life. And here I am today talking about it. So I'm very grateful for that experience. So thank you all for listening.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Debbie, and I'm going to be focusing on my grandpa and Vietnam vets, kind of like in the post-war situation. So that is where my paper will be sitting. So introduction to the paper. I'm going to be talking about the socio-economic dynamics in Vietnam following post-fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. That is where I get a lot more information in terms of my grandpa as a story, because I've asked my dad, and he was like, I don't have much info about my grandpa during the war, so I'm just gonna give you post-war. So, and I've been growing up hearing a ton of stories, kind of like post-war from my dad's perspective growing up. And these are like the points that I will be covering concerning my paper overall. So they were out of order. I don't know what they're going to, where I will be placing them, but I'm going to be talking about my grandpa, the Vietnam vets, in terms of like, overall story, as well as the overall story of post-war Vietnam in terms of socio-economic dynamics. And it's the reason why I want to choose the Vietnam vets as well is to complement the struggles of the Vietnamese population in Vietnam, but also the Vietnam vets stories here in the States as a whole. And kind of my approach to the paper, there was like a ton of challenges, including the lack of and the overwhelming amount of sources, considering there's a lot about the Vietnam War itself, and post-war trickles down, so it's just kind of like hard to find the right source from secondary sources like books to memoirs, and including JSTOR and Library of Congress. And thankfully for the Library of Congress archives, they do have a ton of like audios and like them archiving all the Vietnam veterans' stories and such. And the overall structure of the paper, it's still coming together, honestly, but I know what I am kind of like covering in that sense. And he was my grandfather, so they would put last name, then first name in Asia for culture-wise. So he was born in Hanam. It's a province in North Vietnam on August 6, 1943, and he passed away in 2013 because of cancer. This is him. This is my grandma. This is 10, 11-year-old me. This is my sister. So that's kind of like this was thinking around 2012, 2011, late 2011, early 2012, give or take around that time period. So this is a map, just kind of like show you where Hainan province is. It's right here, and it's right next door to Hanoi as like a city in terms of like location wise. So in the subsequent years following April 30th, 1975, he was captured in terms of like that first week or so, following the fall of Saigon, mainly because his position in the South Vietnamese Army as a lieutenant, which is give or take the equivalent as a major here from the U.S. Army. So I did not realize that my grandpa was a lieutenant. I heard stories from my dad that he was, hey, you know what? Your grandpa was a huge US supporter. And I found out that he works in the army. I'm like, hold on, wait, what? New thing, right? So he was in a re-education camp and his duration was for 18 months there. And it does follow with officers, intellects, and anyone who kind of like have that relation with South Vietnam, America. So it was over 1 million people who were like sent off to these camps to work as re-education, and there's like 5 different levels to their punishment in a sense. And honestly, I did not realize this, but it's a lot to like take in, so that's where like secondary courses like come in. And there was like one of like his conditions to like be let go was in terms of like exile. He was exiled, him and the family was exiled for 3 years in terms of going to the family pagoda. At the time, it wasn't part of the city and it was considered as the countryside, so thankfully that was there. He made an executive decision to actually come back to Saigon because of financial reasons, which I will kind of go into in a bit. So Saigon, that's where my parents was, like, well, my paternal family was, and my grandpa and his cohort were basically going to Saigon, which is a very, very mountainous range. And from what I've heard from my dad was that him and his fellow cohort, I would say, have to cut down trees in order to grow crops and such to actually survive. And kind of like going with post 75 is where my major people is kind of like focusing on is that in the subsequent years, there's a lot of like agriculture like output that has failed. In 78, the national production of rice and other foodstuffs had fallen by 7%, which is a lot considering the economy during that time was in shambles because of World War II, the first kind of like independent war with France. And then the 20-year-long war with America. So it just war after war after war, which kind of like already ravaged a country that's already dealing with a lot of like problems. And in 1981, there were like a major rationings in Ho Chi Minh City. So that would be equivalent to 4 pounds of rice, give or take around 11 pounds of like other crops such as sweet potatoes, and just over 3 ounces of meat per person per month. So that was kind of like the rationings at that time. And kind of like during this time too, there's huge migrations outwards to countries like America and many skirmishes and with along the northern borders with China and the western borders with Cambodia. Many of you will have known the boat people. That is one of like the first things that comes to mind for Vietnamese refugees. And there were like a lot of like problems because between 1975 and 1995, over 3 million refugees have fled in the Indochina region, which is Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So that is like already like huge influx of countries trying to like recuperate on their own population as well as intaking, because in the region, not a lot of people, like not a lot of the governments have recognized boat people. And kind of like touching upon Vietnam vets, many stories have shared similar themes, especially when they came back. There's like a lot of pain, there's a lot of uphill battle in terms of like government and the American society as a whole. And there's like a lot of suffering. There was stuff from Agent Orange that were affecting them, PTSD and such. They were faced with a lot of political and like social backlashes, such as lacking GI benefits and poor overall government treatment. And there were no welcome home parades for the vets compared to the parties that were kind of like showing them going off to Vietnam. So there was a huge disconnect there. Though the Gulf War, kind of like late 80s and early 90s, provided a huge shift in perspective because there was the memorial, the Wall Memorial up in DC. I have been there. It was being there as a Viet and a history major is actually quite a different story. So the 90s provided a huge change of shift in perspective, and they start the Vietnam vets have start providing their own recognition, which is almost 20 years later. So there's that. Highlighted sources. I've actually brought some of them with me. This book provided a good brief history, personally for me, because I didn't learn anything like post Vietnam or like the general Vietnamese history. Because even though I've learned it, I didn't. It was just basis, foundational level. So there's a full chapter on 75 to like present day, which is really nice and kind of like understanding the economy and everything that's going on. Home to War. This is one huge book just on the Vietnam vets and their fights while they were here in the States, kind of like those who were. So it is a really good book. And final book. This one. Really good book in terms of providing. There's a whole chapter on providing both the American perspective, but also the perspective in Vietnam, kind of like which complements a brief history of Vietnam. So, yes, that is all.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name's Thomas Darney. It's a pleasure to see all of our professors here today, to see all of you students and your families. And today my presentation will be about Vietnam, so following up on the theme of Vietnam, but more specifically, the story of my grandfather, Jim Jansma, and the huge overrepresentation of the working class in the draft itself. My grandpa's not here today. He is traveling, as he always does. He takes the term of enjoying retirement to the next level. So, Grandpa, when you're listening, I hope I can make you proud of this presentation. So this presentation will kind of go over paper structure will look like and the topics themselves. So my introduction to the paper will relate to the Vietnam War. And again, how the working class more often than not were first to be drafted. My grandfather, James, or he goes by Jim Jansma, was one of those men. He was 18 years of age when he set foot in Vietnam. How old are you? You're 20?
12.
You're 12? Okay. I thought you look 18. I mean, there's some of us in here that are close to the age of 18, and that stuck out to me, right? Couldn't imagine going off to war when I was 18 years old in a country that I didn't know. My problem statement, the draft of the working class into the Vietnam War, raises significant questions regarding the socioeconomic factors influencing conscription practices. Despite the ostensibly random selection process, there is a noticeable overrepresentation of individuals from lower income backgrounds in the drafted population. Some more background. The draft of the working class into the Vietnam War during the 60s and the 70s remains, again, a subject of significant historical inquiry and debate. This period marked a tumultuous chapter of American history, characterized by the widespread opposition to the war and then the implementation of the military draft, which compelled millions of young men to serve in the armed forces. Some of the factors I'll be going over that led to the overrepresentation of the working class. One was economic disparities. Significant economic disparities marked the socioeconomic landscape of the mid-20th century in America. Working class individuals were often employed in manual labor or low-paying jobs, and a lot of them faced limited opportunities for upward mobility. Many young men from these backgrounds saw military service as a means to secure a stable income and benefits, including access to education and healthcare, often lacking in civilian life. For my grandfather, this was one of the factors that led him to going over to Vietnam. Although a lot of his classmates from his high school, to avoid the draft, they either got married or were able to go to college. Those were one of the two factors that allowed you to defer your military service. Moving on to some of the geographic disparities, the draft system relied on local draft boards to administer conscription, leading to geographic variations in recruitment practices. Working class neighborhoods, particularly in urban and rural areas, were more heavily targeted by draft boards, resulting in a higher concentration of working class individuals being drafted into the military. My grandfather, Jim Jansma, grew up in Dune, Iowa, and if you don't know where that is or ever heard of it, it's okay. I didn't either until he told me. It's a rural working class town where most families operate a farm. He grew up on a farm for the first 18 years of his life. And just a funny backstory, they were so poor that they didn't have running water or plumbing in their house. And one of my favorite stories that he told me was going outside in the winter when it's negative 40 degrees outside. He's all bundled up. He has to go in the outhouse and he's got to take a leak in the middle of the night. Goes into the outhouse, takes a leak, and it was so cold outside that the urine froze within 10 seconds. So just imagine that. Little things like that we're grateful for, right? Being able to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night in our house was not an opportunity that he was afforded growing up. But to continue, the political and cultural factors, political and cultural climate of the time also played a role in shaping recruitment patterns. Working class communities, often marginalized and disenfranchised, were less likely to have the social and political capital to influence draft board decisions or obtain deferments through connections or special favors. Additionally, the escalation of the Vietnam War and the need for a large military force led to increased pressure on draft boards to meet quotas, resulting in a higher likelihood of drafting individuals from working class backgrounds. My main body will go over the historical context of the Vietnam War, and why World War II, at the end of World War II, we see a massive influx of babies being born. Also the massive expansion of the middle class. And so we have a large pool of individuals that the draft can pull from for the Vietnam War. My grandfather faced some of those challenges of economic disparity, and then also was in the draft population. Again, as the son of a farmer who was raised in Sioux Center, Iowa. Again, just going over some of the socioeconomic characteristics of the draftees. Then also another factor was race, as African American and Hispanic individuals were also more likely to be drafted from or facing a higher likelihood of being drafted. But I want to move into the cultural impacts of the Vietnam War and then the draft. The Vietnam War sparked widespread opposition and activism across American society. The draft disproportionately again affected those working class communities and became a focal point for anti-war sentiments. This anti-war movement contributed to a broader culture of protest and dissent. Again, that overrepresentation really contributed to a deep sense of injustice that affected the social divisions and growing skepticism of authority among working class Americans. Something I also want to touch on was the returning home from the war. Many working class veterans face challenges coming back into society within civilian life, the physical and psychological traumas of combat, coupled with the social stigma associated with the Vietnam War, compounded the difficulties for returning to life, right? These veterans often struggle to access adequate healthcare, education, employment opportunities, making those problems that already existed before the war, those socioeconomic problems, worse thereafter. And some of my sources, obviously, oral testimony from my grandfather was probably the biggest source that I used in this process. And a second source was also a book written by my grandpa's commanding officer in the Vietnam War, and kind of just goes over the stories and the experiences that he and his fellow men shared in their time there. And then the last one, my secondary source, just kind of going over the Vietnam era military service test of the class bias theory thesis. And then these are some personal photos that my grandfather took when he was in Vietnam. My grandfather is right there. These are Polaroids of his 1 year service over there. And this one was actually pretty interesting. The one on the right is a leaflet from the North Vietnamese. These are like propaganda posters that they would bring into the towns in which they were operating. My grandfather's unit was charged with interrupting the supply chain of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And a lot of the times they had to go into the nearby villages and do night raids to disrupt the supply. But I'll go ahead and read that for you guys. It's pretty interesting. Intellectuals, students, and U.S. progressive people all over the United States have no desire to support this war. They don't want their boys dead uselessly. That's 55,000 U.S. boys laid down their lives in Vietnam for the selfish interests of Nixon. They have absolutely condemned the Nixon war and demanded an end to this war. Repatriation of all U.S. troops. And so the translation isn't perfect, but again, I thought that was really interesting. So my grandpa brought several of those leaflets home. He still has them at his house today and actually donated to the Vietnam War Museum as well. And then 2 more photos, and that's it. Thank you guys.
Hi, I'm Ethan. Yes, there you go. Yeah, this is my presentation right here. She's Duham, Rural Industry, Labor, Family. I didn't want to make this presentation just about the paper or just about the facts or anything like that, because something that I noticed that my grandma stressed a lot was her family. And I was gonna keep on coming back. But of course, it still has to do with the numbers and statistics that happened in the place she was, the place she was raised, where she worked, all of that. It's important to remember that we document history, at least for this project, because we want to keep the memory of these people and our families alive, right? I lost both my grandfathers growing up when I was younger. And I never got to record them talking about their history or anything like that. And so this is a very important project for me, not because it was due for paper, a 20-page paper, but also because I needed to document her story on video, on record, and on paper. Yeah. So without further ado, here we go. Her upbringing started in Pontiac, Michigan, where she was born in 1947, to her father McClellan and to her mother Euphemia. Which great names, by the way, right? I'm gonna use those for sure. But her maiden name is Stamper. And she had 3 sisters. She unfortunately lost her oldest sister when she was very young. Before I think Tila was born. But yeah. Spent most of her early life of moving back and forth, from Michigan to Kentucky, where her parents are from. Michigan, they ended up moving back to because labor was steadily on the rise and had been for quite a while. In fact, it was like so popular that, it was just a necessary move, but it wouldn't stay that way, unfortunately. In her adolescence, Tila was raised in Kentucky for the most part. And eventually her family made the final move up to Michigan, for a year until her parents separated and she moved to California to be with her dad while her sisters and her mom stayed in Michigan. Unfortunately, though, she lost her mother a year later after that, at a very young age, and that was a common theme. It's hard to talk about that with these kinds of presentations, and even in the interview, it was really difficult. But I think it was very necessary to document this kind of stuff. But yeah, after that, she moved back and forth from California to Michigan. So it just mostly travels around those three states: Kentucky, California, Michigan. But she would eventually move to Indiana, with her, then husband, and, both my eldest aunts were born. After that, she moved to Michigan, where she met my grandfather at work, and my mom and her sister were born. Again, these things are considered the most important part of her life, right? I can't deny, I mean, they're very important in my life. My mom, I couldn't have done any of this without her, and I couldn't have done any of the work for you guys. But eventually, they moved to California. We'll talk a little more about this. Aerodynamics was booming in California, while manufacturing in Detroit had been just not doing very well. As they've heard, it was the Motor City, right? Wouldn't stay like that. Unfortunately, well, sorry, not unfortunately, now we're going into labor. She worked at Superior Polishing, where she met my grandfather. My grandfather was the foreman, and so it's kind of funny hearing a story of someone who worked on the line of the cars, and then me and the foreman falling in love, taking his last name, having kids. It was nice to hear that. And then she eventually, I believe, was it that you were laid off, or that you were you just moved to Chrysler, another car company, again, Motor City. There was a lot of auto manufacturing here. But she joined the 1973 Union, the Union Association, United Auto Workers Union, something like that. I forgot what UAW stands for. But she joined that strike. It was a very monumental strike. I was able to find a New York Times article about this. It was very interesting. She worked at General Dynamics after that, after moving to California, where she worked soldering the motherboards of ship-to-air missiles, which is really interesting to learn. Like, this is complicated stuff. I've seen those motherboards. I could never do something like that. And apparently she actually went to some of these bases and repaired some of the like ship-to-air missiles. Again, these kinds of things would have possibly been used in like if the Cold War would ever get hot, or if we were to enter some sort of like conflict during that time. After that, however, she worked a couple of dozen of jobs, like working all over, from retail to car rental services, or now she works as a real estate agent. Very good at it, especially, yeah. But yeah, kind of talk about Detroit, where she came from, where much of her life was spent. At the height of its population in 1950, it was 1.85 million people, which is a lot. And about 16% of them would work in the auto industry, and that's a high number. I put down here the least cost theory. Basically, the entire idea behind Detroit's like rise in auto manufacturing was because it was in a perfect place, positioned with coal coming in from the south and metal coming in from the north, from Minnesota. And so they were everything was kind of in the right place. It was the perfect place to start a lot of where a lot of auto companies ended up, Ford, Chrysler, Cadillac, yeah, a lot of those places. Oh, and also the 12th Street riots happened in 1967. This is a very monumental time in Detroit history. She actually told me a story that I found interesting, where her sister and brother-in-law, I believe, were walking around outside during curfew hours during the riots, and she had to actually go out and like tell them, hey, they're here to see us, not like they're not part of the riots at all. That must have been scary. But unfortunately, but yeah, there was also massive strikes, unions, like the ones she worked with, mobilized countless times during this era. There was also a massive trend of outsourcing manufacturing jobs. Yeah, this is where the auto industry kind of starts falling. They realize that labor is getting way too costly. So that whole Iskata theory, it just ended up tanking. I don't blame unions personally, because it was still necessary that these auto unions have, the people in these unions have the wages to start a family like my grandma did. But it's clear that like it immediately started falling out of fashion, right? Where is Detroit today? It's been a series of highs and lows, right? Had a massive population decrease. You might remember 1.85 million people by 1950. It dropped more than 1 million people up to today, and it's still dropping as I understand it. But developers have taken an interest. There's been a lot of development in like things like service. There still is manufacturing there. It's not very big, but it's growing. Unfortunately, however, the city had filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. So not exactly still doing very as good as it used to. But service jobs are increasing, so it's a growing city, as my family keeps on telling me. They want me to go visit out there again. I might, maybe not. Where's Sheila's family today? Well, I mean, here's the family out here. Here's a little picture. Here's a picture of little me back there. This is my grandfather. And my whole extended family, got my aunts and uncles and cousins and all that. That's my mom's wedding. She didn't want me to put that photo in it. You were there? Didn't know. But where are we? Happy. That's the main. That's the main thing there. Yeah. No, it was very interesting to do this project. I learned a lot, and my main sources just kind of came down to the interview. Really, I saw a bunch of things from the United States Census Bureau to New York Times, like articles about stuff that my grandma would have been involved in, and a lot of stuff about the riots. I was very interested to learn about. Some family history there was really interesting. But yeah, I guess that's kind of the end of it. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, thank you all for being here. This is my research paper presentation. A man who helped feed a nation, the life of my great-grandfather. His name was Walter Arthur Nelson. So this is a little bit of background on my paper, but also what I will be going over in my presentation. Who he was, what he did, what matters most, and whom I hope to be. So this is a picture of my great-grandfather, actually a little bit before he passed away. He always joked never to go into the produce industry, and his sons and both my dad and his brother are in the produce industry. So, so who he was. So he was born on June 10th in 1921 in Iowa. My grandpa didn't know the city he was born in, but you know, the state of Iowa. He later moved to Southern California, where he lived the remainder of his life, or until retirement, I should say. And he went into the service around the age of 18. He graduated from high school, but he never went into college, which is kind of a key thing to remember. It was then in San Diego he met my great-grandmother through the USO, United Service Organization. He was in the service for 4 years, and he got out of the service in 1945 and then married my grandmother that December. They then shortly after welcomed my uncle, their son, in 1946, and then a few years later, my grandpa in 1949. So this is a picture of their 30th wedding anniversary. This is my Uncle Joel and then my grandpa, Steve. I believe it's their 30th. It wasn't labeled, so it's either their 25th or 30th, but just going off of their ages and how they look, we agreed on their 30th. So, a little bit about him. He was stationed in San Diego. He was a naval air, engineer mechanic, and he was never deployed. If you asked him, that was a very, salty subject. He was very, a little angry that he never got the chance to get deployed, but he was thankful that he got to stay in San Diego. He was very handy. He always wanted to own a convenience store. Unfortunately, that never happened. He did open a grocery store in San Diego near El Cajon Boulevard. Times were tough, and the grocery store kind of struggled. So one of the major, grocery chains was Food Basket. They had about 6 stores in San Diego. And he decided, you know what, I can't compete. I'm just going to join you. So he joined, Food Basket and shortly after became one of their food managers. Again, this was a time of prosperity for the grocery industry, and Lucky Stores then came down to Southern California and bought out my uncle or my great grandfather and all of Food Basket. So he took this Lucky grocery chain and grew it nationwide. It started in California, really in Northern California, took it down here to Southern California, and then my great grandfather became their produce manager, and their goal was to just distribute it across the United States. So this picture is his retirement party for Lucky Stores, and he worked there for 35 years. This is a picture of him speaking at many of the produce conferences he attended. And this is a picture taken when he was the president of the Produce Marketing Association, the PMA, which my dad goes to every year. It's held here in Anaheim. And so seeing him be the president and my dad shortly later attend is really cool to see. So after working 35 years with Lucky Stores, he retired and sold his house in Fullerton and wanted to go to the desert like most old people. That's my dad's retirement goal. So he had what he called his play money. So my great grandma couldn't even touch it. It was his money. And he had this dream to open Christmas tree lots, and eventually they had pumpkins as well. So this is Wally spraying fake snow on his beloved Christmas trees. And he did that until he passed away, which is interesting and something I really did not know. So what matters most? He loved to travel. So this is a picture of him and my great grandma traveling. He loved his family. He worked a really busy life. He wasn't always prosperous, but he made time for his family. And working 6, sometimes 7 days a week, he made time to go to my grandpa, uncle's little league games. They even started a bowling club at their school, and he got to attend every week with them, which was something that my grandpa and uncle really admired about him. And a lot of people trusted him. So one story was he would get his Christmas trees delivered before the Christmas season, and he wouldn't have to pay for them until after the Christmas season was done. And so just, again, that kind of showed how much people trusted him. They knew that he was gonna get, they were gonna get their payments. And so he would always say, your word means everything. If you say it, you must follow through with it. And I think that is really just a true testament of who he was and who a lot of people thought him to be. So again, who I hope to be. After learning about my great grandfather, I hope to be half the person he is. Having an honorable character and reputation is something my dad and my parents have instilled in me, but I think it starts with him as well, of having a mentality that is both hardworking and family oriented. It is definitely something that is hard to balance, but I'm really grateful for the many examples I have in my life that uphold that standard, and a legacy I really hope to continue. One of my sources is a book by Kevin Starr. Doctor has, told me about this book, and it's from it's called California Age of Abundance. So it says, economically, this growth was at once the result and the symbol of the takeoff era of what many economic historians have described as the single greatest arc of rising prosperity in American history, and quite possibly in all of modern history as well. So I say that to close. My great grandfather really got to be somebody that took a period in American history and ran with it. He helped Lucky Stores become the grocery chain that they are. And kind of what my title is, a lot of people don't realize the amount of growth and, I guess you really do help feed a nation, especially in California. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. So getting to see my great grandfather put in the work that he did and take a grocery store and help feed other people outside of California is really special to see, and something that I'm forever grateful for, and I get to see directly from my dad and my uncle as well. So I believe this is my bibliography of some of my sources, but that was it.
My name is Cassandra, and my paper is going to be on the impact of the Vietnam War on Chicano lives. I hope it's more of a tribute to my grandfather. So for the contents, I'll be talking about Chicanos in the war, so the draft and enlistment, and as well as John's reasoning. And then I'll go into casualties and injuries. And then after that, I'll go into Chicanos back home, so kind of like the sentiments of the time. And then I'll go into post-war effects. So the main things Chicanos are struggling with were PTSD and substance abuse. And then I'll go into John's struggles as well. So enlistment. So many Chicanos enlisted in the war rather than drafted. That is not to say that a lot weren't drafted, but a lot of them, majority enlisted. And there is a few reasons for that. A lot of them felt the need to prove their American identity. In one of my sources, in Yvonne's book, it states that the desire to prove loyalty to the U.S. was repeated often in her interviews. And then the other factor is push-out rates. So during this time period, Chicanos dropout rates were as high as 60% in places such as East LA, which is where a majority of Chicanos lived during the time. And then, so these rates have been dubbed as push-out rates because it's implying that the school system just didn't care about Chicano students and they're just negligent towards them. And so students were pushed out due to factors such as lack of quality education, unfair disciplinary actions, as well as interpersonal racism. So push-out rates are important to enlistment because many Chicanos felt like they had no choice but to enlist. And then there's also socioeconomic factors. So many Chicanos experienced poverty and unemployment during this time. So for example, in East LA, the median income of a Mexican-American family was $7,622 compared to the California median of $10,729. That is a 29% difference between the two. So the service was a way for the families to gain financial stability. And then to move into John's reasoning. So John enlisted into Vietnam in 1968 and his tour was 10 months. So he came back in 1969. Prior to his Vietnam tour, he did tour in Korea, patrolling the DMZ. And so John was given the choice of enlistment or jail time due to a criminal charge that he never spoke of with his family. And so we don't actually know what happened, but we do know that he had a troubled childhood. So John dropped out of school at 9th grade and was always getting into trouble with his siblings. But he had a family history of service. So in his therapy papers, he talks about his two uncles and his father who served in World War II. And he describes his family as very patriotic. So ultimately, John chose enlistment, and that's when he went to his Korea tour. And then after that, as for Vietnam, John enlisted in hopes that his brother Bob would not be drafted into the Vietnam War. So this photo right here Right under the 8 is my grandfather, John, and that is him in the airport on his way to Vietnam. So to get into the draft, at this time, Chicanos did not have high rates of college enrollment. And so a lot of them weren't eligible for deferment through college enrollment. So we aren't able to provide an exact number for how many Chicanos were drafted because they were grouped with just white people. And so they're kind of just mixed in. But it's estimated that 83,000 to 170,000 Chicanos served in Vietnam. So, the way that they got this estimate was based on surnames. So just last names, they went through all the last names. And then, so since the Chicanos did not have a high enrollment for college, one of the examples is that in the University of California, only 1% of the 97,000 students enrolled were Chicano, and this was in 1969. And then to go into Eduardo Cruz Ramirez, this is our Uncle Bob. This was John's brother. He was drafted in 1969, and according to his brother David, he seemed content with the news of his draft. He said that he would go and that was okay. And so the brothers John and Bob never saw each other again after John's enlistment in 1968. And then it's because as Bob was leaving to Vietnam, John was coming home, so they could just get him. So to get into the project specifically, as I said earlier, we don't know the exact amount Chicanos who served in Vietnam. However, we did find that they were dying at disproportionate rates. So the estimate is based on surnames again. So Ralph C. Guzman revealed that between January 1961 and February 1967, Chicanos accounted for 19.4% of deaths, despite making up only 10 to 12% of the Southwest population. The Southwest is where a majority of Chicanos resided during that time. So ultimately, this revealed that Chicanos were dying at disproportionate rates compared to other races and ethnicities. So as for John's brother, he would be killed on November 12, 1970. So he died in Long Con province after suffering a gunshot to his chest. In John's therapy session, he talks about this. So he just states that Bob was hit and was alive, but the medevac couldn't land in time because it was too hot. So when the medevac finally landed, it was too late for Bob. So Chicanos back home, the war got a lot of criticism and pushback. A big example of this was the August 29, 1970 Chicano moratorium. And this was an anti-war protest led by the National Chicano Moratorium Committee against the Vietnam War. So in the Chicano magazine La Raza, it actually states the summary of the committee's need for the anti-war movement. And the text states, historically, Chicanos have only been offered the dirtiest work of American society. Chicanos pick the crops, man the factories, sew the clothes, wash the dishes, and clean the mess of white America. The demonstrations aim to expose that, second to the Vietnamese, the heaviest burdens of the war have fallen on the Chicano community. The Chicano people, through its moratorium, is now saying that the front line for Chicano youth is not in Vietnam, but in the struggle for social justice here in the U.S. So this is where sayings such as "Nuestra batalla no está en Vietnam, está aquí" comes from. So Chicanos were speaking out about their struggles and have been fighting for a number of years for equality at this point. So the chant, "Charlie, no, we won't go," was a way to resist the draft. And it was actually started by Rosalio Munoz. So on September 16, 1969, Munoz went to the Armed Forces Induction and Examination Center with over 100 supporters. He then accused the U.S. government of genocide against the Chicano people. And he refused to be drafted after that. So this photo is just a flyer of the Chicano moratorium. And then this one is a clipping of the newspaper La Raza, just explaining the Chicano moratorium. And then these next photos, they're just to show a little bit more of the sentiments of the time. So we will often see people holding crosses with Chicanos who died in the war with their names on it, as well as like talking about genocide. There's also a person who died in the Chicano moratorium named Ruben Salazar, and he has a very interesting story as well. So to go into the post-war effects, this quote is from the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Service Study. So it states, overall, it appears that Black and Hispanic veterans have experienced more mental health and life adjustment problems subsequent to their service in Vietnam than white and other veterans. Hispanics and Blacks shared a number of problems, including elevated rates of PTSD, overall adjustment problems, and lower levels of life satisfaction. For Hispanics, problems were particularly manifested in high rates of PTSD and other psychiatric disorders such as alcohol abuse, independence, and generalized anxiety. So to get into the numbers of it, according to the NBVRS, the current prevalence of PTSD was estimated to be 13.7 among whites, and then 20.6 among Blacks, and 27.9% for Hispanics. And then the HWZ stands for high war zone. So it's just an elevated rate for those who were in high war zone areas. And then the lifetime prevalence of any psychiatric disorder was also highest among Hispanics. So they had a percentage of 67% compared to Black veterans at 50% and white and other veterans at 48%. And then the prevalence of PTSD is also higher among those who never finished high school, specifically 28.7%. So this is important to note because a lot of the Chicanos during that time had high dropout rates. And then another important factor is the branch in which Chicanos served in the military. So men who served in the military or Marine Corps are 16.2% and 24% more likely than those who served in other branches to experience higher levels of PTSD. So according to Guzman, a substantial number of Latinos served in high-risk branches such as the Marine Corps. To move on to substance abuse, Chicanos also had a higher rate of lifetime alcohol abuse and dependence, with their percentage being at 50.1%, Blacks being at 35.8%, and white and others being at 38.9%. So this is a quote by Boca Negra. In addition to high rates of PTSD, factors such as racism in the war, readjustment to their life after war, and experience of more overall distress were considered possible contributions toward alcohol and substance abuse among Hispanic service members. So to get into the struggles of John, he struggled with PTSD, panic disorder with agoraphobia, substance abuse, and survivor's guilt. So with the PTSD, he had like hallucinations, suicidal ideations, flashbacks, nightmares. And then one nightmare that was common, and I can see it in a lot of his therapy papers, was the idea that the dead from Vietnam, such as his brother Bob and the people he may have hurt during that time, were coming back to get him piece by piece, to take him away. So he said that he felt that this idea of his and dreams of his were becoming reality because of he lost his 2 legs due to amputation. He also lost his index finger, as well as his gallbladder, and at this time he was also facing renal failure. And so that was like a fear of his. And then for panic disorder and agoraphobia, he didn't like leaving the house at all. And he was very closed off to people, even his family. So growing up, I just thought my grandpa didn't really like being, sorry. I just thought he didn't like being like around like loud noises, or does he like the quiet? But I didn't realize until recently that he just couldn't handle the kind of like the loudness of his family. And then as for substance abuse, he struggled with alcohol addiction, marijuana addiction, and tobacco addiction. So in the Army, he was given reds and whites, which were uppers and downers. So what that was the military gave them uppers just to stay alert while in the field. And then they gave them downers for when they came back, just to help them from the uppers. And then in therapy sessions, John also mentioned he would smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. And then as for his survivor guilt, he had a lot of survivor's guilt from his brother Bob. So he talks about Bob multiple times in his therapy sessions. He said that he hasn't been able to cry since entering Vietnam. And he's just kind of angry at the whole entire situation. He also has survivor guilt from the friends he lost along the way and the guilt for people's lives that he had to take. However, despite all of his challenges, John was amazing. He was very funny. During October, he would always joke about leaving his legs out on the lawn. So, yeah, despite his struggles, he was really.
I'm Stephen Smith. My paper is going to be about Jackie Robinson. So we all start somewhere. I recently found out that I was actually the great niece of Jackie Robinson, and to show how proud I am to be a part of his legacy, I wanted to tackle this paper. There's no doubt that his story is undeniably a big mark on history, especially through sports and civil rights. So my family tie, I am his great-great-grandniece, and his legacy is now, I know, really ingrained with my family history. I found this out through my dad, who I actually don't really have that big of a connection to. So this was a great project for me to just be able to get to know him a little more, get to see his side of the family a little more. And it really has put a big impact on me for my personal investment. Jackie Robinson was married to Rachel Robinson, and this is mainly how I'm connected to him through my family. They met while attending UCLA, and they were married on February 10th, which actually is my grandmother's birthday. That was really kind of coinciding. And they remained married until Jackie's death, but together they had 3 children, and sadly, his first son actually ended up passing away from a car accident later on in his life. But Rachel was known for having such a strong commitment to Jackie. She has pointed out many times that I knew that he went through so much, but he seemed so strong, so she felt that she had to be there for him. She's still alive today. She's about 101 years old. And so I got the opportunity to speak with her, which is pretty cool. So in his early life, he was born as Jack Roosevelt Robinson, later nicknamed Jackie. And he was born in Georgia. He actually is the youngest of 5 children, and his parents, Jerry and Mally Robinson, were sharecroppers. Eventually later, his father abandoned the family. And later, Mally took all her kids and basically raised them as a single parent in Pasadena, California. And his oldest brother actually ended up being an Olympic medalist for track, which is actually pretty crazy. And despite facing racial segregation and discrimination, he excelled very well in academics and sports, and eventually he did go to junior college here in Pasadena, California. Here's some pictures. So on the left is him and his wife and their 3 kids. And then this is the son's oldest that ended up passing away. And then on the right is his family, like painting, like a painting, like a portrait. And that's him and all his siblings. He's the very youngest, the smallest. And he looks very cute, but they said he was pretty mischievous. This is their home. Obviously, you can see that they kind of lived a impoverished life. They didn't have the biggest home with all those children, but he pointed out that through growing up, his mom made it such a dream for him. He almost said that, like, he basically said in his book that his mom was like magical. Like, she would work as a housekeeper and do all these things by herself, but then would come home, never complain, and just made it like so fun for them. And I think that's really great because my mother raised me as a single parent, and I appreciate that so much. He played more than baseball. He is known for breaking the color barrier in the MLB, but he had a brief career in many other sports. He not only played track and field, but he also did a little basketball and football. And he was really good at UCLA. And he actually beat his own brother's long jump record, which was pretty insane. So here's a picture of him jumping, and then it's a picture of the baseball. So he has many achievements, obviously, as an athlete. And these are very vital points in history, especially considering the time we lived in. Obviously, everything was still segregated. There was lots of racial disputes. And I couldn't imagine having enough courage to go out there and do that and be the first. But it is definitely inspiring. And to know that so many people did end up embracing him is really amazing.
He was actually a very faithful man, so I ended up finding this book about how, it was like a biography written in the spiritual form. I found it here in the library, surprisingly. Jackie Robinson was actually, he grew up a very devout Christian. His mother really raised him in the faith. And you can see that later on a lot through his civil rights activism. He even made a point that, like, he said a quote, racism is a man-made thing, not a God. He talks to him and talks about God and God's presence in his life, and he wrote about how his faith helped him withstand racism and the hatred that he encountered. Obviously, I'm gonna go more into the color barrier in my paper, but we all know that he faced many hardships when it came to this. He just wanted to play sports, and obviously there's so many of those little mountains and obstacles in the way just from the social norms of the time. This really did put an impact on integration later, especially within sports, which was really interesting to see. And despite the big pressure, he still persevered. This, is on the right, you have a news article kind of talking about how he was able to play baseball, but they really wanted him out. And then on the left is actually a death threat. So he constantly received death threats and letters like this in the mail. And I couldn't imagine someone straight up just throwing me a newspaper saying, I'm gonna kill you. Like, I couldn't imagine to do that, but yet he still, after persevered and decided, you know what, they might throw stuff at me, and might hurt me out there, but I'm still gonna go and try my best. And those are just things that I just could never see myself do. I'm a pretty social butterfly, but that takes definitely a lot more courage. A lot of people don't know that he had military involvement. So Dr. Robinson served in the Army during World War II. During that, he was actually, he had an altercation where he was supposed to move to the back of the bus and he decided not to. And so they court-martialed him and because he refused to move, to the back of the segregated bus. And it was pretty interesting to hear about his experience with them because he also was in a segregated military unit. So they were, even within helping your country, they're gonna separate you and put you in different little groups. This is a picture of him in the military. Civil rights activism. He was a very predominant figure throughout this. He campaigned for civil rights. He spoke out against racial discrimination in all aspects of his life. But he also was very close with people like Martin Luther King Jr. Continued, he contributed as a really big part of the NAACP and also within the Southern Christian Leaders Conference. So not only was he involved in such a big national association, but also through his faith, you could really see him push his faith. And he participated in many protests. And there's him walking, he's the second from the left. And then his legacy, he obviously puts a big influence on future generations like me. I obviously grew up heavily in sports, and I'm glad that I am able to be so many different types of people. He continued his fight for equality, and later after his death, they have a foundation that honored him. And they used to actually give a bunch of scholarships out to certain kids with minority backgrounds and help them get through college. My personal takeaway is that his courage and perseverance has inspired me to speak more out about racial injustices within my own life. And I hope to spark change just like him and hopefully be the first one day of something really cool. I try to utilize as many books and interviews as possible, so I got to talk to his wife. She's still alive. She's obviously very old, so it's kind of hard to push for some more difficult details. But she was a very sweet woman. Luckily, he had an autobiography, which is really cool, so I kind of got to hear his own life in his own words, which was very beautiful. And then obviously different articles and academic sources about him. But if you're looking for a book about Jackie Robinson in our library, it's probably in my room, so you might want to wait a few minutes. Here's some more sources. And then obviously my one standout source that I would say, these are three of them, but my really big one is his autobiography called I Never Had Made It. And it's very interesting to see how someone with such a big career thought that he still hadn't made it. he still felt like he had to do something and go out there and really just not only evangelize, but also just really get help other people get their foot in the door. He didn't just sit in his own family success, which is very honorable, and now his number's retired and everything, which is so cool. And then in conclusion, his impact on American history and civil rights is undeniable. Courage and perseverance in breaking the color-bearing baseball has paved the way for social change and equality in sports. Let's honor his legacy by continuing to fight for equality and justice for all. Thank you.
I don't know how to top that off. That's Jack. Bob. Yeah, Padre fans and Angels, you can leave. Kidding. But my story, well, not my story, but this is my mother. I'm doing my paper on my mother. She grew up in Mexico. But the title of my paper is An Immigrant Prospect, Cynthia Salazar. That's my mother. She was still in Mexico. When she graduated high school at Saddleback. And then another picture near her home in Mexico. So just the contents, I got 6 sections. For childhood, migration, early life, arriving to the United States, living life as a young adult, and then applying for citizenship, and then now what she does for work. So my thesis, an uncertain decision to cross the border and begin a new life in America. My mom displays the strength and resilience that is essential for embracing uncertainty and overcoming life challenges. So this is gonna be what I'm basically gonna talk about in my paper, my body paragraphs. So she was born in Mexico City in 1973. She's the youngest of 9 children, 6 boys and 3 girls. She lived in Las Fuentes, Allende. It was so hard to find where she lived because the address changed. So I had to go on Google, and there's like a certain website on Google that you're able to just like look at houses. Kind of creepy, but it's really, really blurry. But this is her little home back in Mexico. And I don't know what this is now. My mom didn't know what that was. She doesn't know what this is either, but this is her home. It's a 2-story now. They converted it, but back then, when she was around 5 years old, it was only this bottom portion of the house. So she attended school. This little school now is obviously updated more, but it's called Jardín de Niños. And her brothers and sisters went to that school as well. So that's where she gained a lot of friends, learned young life experiences there, and kind of made her who she is now. And then, yeah, so this is the long address now in Mexico. It's like crazy address, but that's how I was able. Migration. So these are the 2 books that I'm using. The distance between us is kind of crazy too, because my first interaction with Dr. Jimenez, we went over that book for our summer bridge class, and now I'm using it for my paper. So that's kind of cool. And then Immigrant America, talking about Latinos coming to the U.S. and making a life for themselves. So she came to the United States when she was 10 years old. She left for a better opportunity. And then for 3 people to come over, including her mother. So it was her sibling and her mother, costed $5,000 roughly to be brought here. So she crossed illegally. She crossed through Tijuana, San Isidro, and then they went through the desert with her 2 sisters and her mom. It took roughly 7 days to get there. And then my mom was describing that as they were going through the desert at night, they would live in these small man-made huts that because there's border patrol, and if you get caught, game over, gotta go back. But they hid in bushes in the morning, she told me, and then for food it was just simple bread and water. And then when she crossed, her second niece was molested, she said, by a gang. I wanted to go deeper and deeper, wanting to be an investigator for a police department. I was trying to use good, tactics, but I kind of messed up because she started to cry, and I was like, okay. So arriving to the United States, my mother was living on the street when she first came here with her mother, and then by the grace of God, a lady opened up her home, and the trade-off was that if my mom and her mom were able to clean, do errands and groceries, whatever they needed, they were able to live rent-free and have meals on the table. And then in Santa Ana, she enrolled in Monte Vista Elementary. She didn't have any good English at first, so she had to do an English second language course or class that was offered at her elementary, short for ESL. My mother felt very lost. She had social anxiety at first. It was tough for her to make friends because she didn't know the language and she was really bullied. My mother said she was called like, terms like wetback, go back to Mexico. That's not a term. She was called that. She was called many other racist names, jokes. So she was really poked fun at growing up. She missed life back home and she stressed to my grandma that she wanted to go back home. But they stuck it out and she wanted a better life. But it was hard for her to adapt. So that was her arriving here. And then life as a young adult, in her twenties, early to mid and then late twenties, she worked 3 jobs. My mom was a housekeeper. She worked at McDonald's. And then she rode her bike on Sundays during the newspapers. She didn't have a social group though growing up. Well, in her mid-twenties still, being a young adult. She didn't have friends as much because she had 3 children. Her first child was at 20, then she had another one in her mid-twenties, and then I was the last child at 28. Extra income, I remember my mom, when I was maybe like 6 years old, my mom did Avon. Avon was like you go door to door and you sell like products like kind of like on a brochure, and you ask people if you want to purchase things, such as like deodorant, other healthcare products, like I remember. So I remember my mom was just a hustler trying to make an income for 3 young children. She taught dancing too for extra money. She did salsa and cumbia. Do a little move here and there. And then she did martial arts. I didn't know that. My mom was a black belt in karate, and then I actually did a paper for Dr. Plummer on martial arts. So maybe I get that from her. So that was pretty cool to do. Oh yeah, I did a move on Ethan. Obtaining citizenship. I was maybe 5 or 6 in 2006. She obtained her citizenship. And I remember going to it's like a big building in downtown Santa Ana. I'm not sure of the name, I should have looked at, but it's a big white building with the United States seal. And I remember my mom coming out with an American flag. I'm like, oh, damn, she's a U.S. citizen now. So all that changed for the better for her because now she's a U.S. citizen and she was so happy. I asked her what the process was like. She said that she had to, study, how to do correct sentences, read. She said that the most difficult part was reading and comprehension for her though. And then through her mom though, at age 15, she became a resident because of her mother's husband at the time. And then after she became a U.S. citizen, she felt more American now because she was so bullied throughout her life. And then she did not fear the stigma of being Mexican. She still fully embraces her roots and, she's full Latina. She just felt more accepted now into America now that she's an American. And then current occupations. So my mom is a party planner, arrangement of all kinds. These are just examples just to show you. She does food, desserts, balloons, proposals, gender reveals, weddings. And then randomly, like an influencer on Instagram saw my mom's page on the Explore page, and she reached out, and that really blew up my mom. So she does little arrangements in Orange County. So I'm like really happy for her that, this is her definition of her American dream. It doesn't need to be a big house. It doesn't need to be anything big like that. She's just happy with what she has, and she's thankful for what she has now in the U.S. So the conclusion is through adversity, tribulations, and the step into the unknown, my mother was able to achieve her definition of the American dream. And then these are just the books that I'm using. I'm using 4 books. The Distance Between Us, Unauthorized Latino Immigrants, Immigrant America, and then Children Crossing the Border. So these are all helping me. It's giving me data on like what the percent of an immigrant coming to the U.S. from Mexico has a chance of making a living. It gives statistics like that. It gives a background on the social life of immigrants coming. Like I talked about in my presentation, that they don't have friends, they miss their home. They have some immigrants develop mental health issues as well. So these books are helping me guiding me through my paper as well. And yeah, my bibliography. But that's about it. Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
Just real quick, I know, lunch is outside, right? So we have still about 5 more presentations. Yeah. So, I don't know, we wanna, yeah, we'll just.
okay, I'll be good, yeah. Don't worry, yeah. Y'all know me, all right, I'm Peyton, yeah, I'm a history poli sci major. Thank you all for being here, I started at the appearance, I've been up since 3 o'clock in the morning for ROTC, so I'm already half asleep right now. But right now I'm talking about my great grandfather on my mother's side, he actually taught at Vanguard for 4 years. And this is just a brief overview of his life story, it's not really an in-depth overview of my paper, that would take too much time. Yeah, so this is a picture of him, and the name of it comes from his autobiography called The Life I Remember, and that was him right about when he died in 2007. But yeah. So he was born on October 21st, 1921, in a small town in Minnesota. He was a third child in a pretty big family, but at that time they had only had 2 other kids. Both his parents worked in the church. But at that time, what was like kind of a predecessor of what would be the Assemblies of God and the early kind of Pentecostal movement was developed around the turn of the going into like the 1920s, right, and kind of the Roaring 20s. Bit of brief history though, it's kind of backlash against the Roaring 20s and a lot of the immorality that was going on, around then. I'm sure you guys know the 20s is not really a kid-friendly time in a lot of American cities. So they didn't really mention any specific reasons for why they left Minnesota, but they kind of left abruptly. He talks about in his autobiography that he basically just got up in a Chrysler one day after the house burned down. But you know, I asked because I wanted to get a new house out there, but they just left and drove out to Sterling City, which is a really small city in Central California, actually Northern California, northeast of Chico, deep in the Sierras. And he said the journey took about like several weeks for them to get there in this 1921 Chrysler. And his whole family is jam-packed in there of all the suitcases and stuff. Sterling City is actually a really interesting story in itself. I know Professor Plummer will appreciate this, the California history, but it was actually, there were about 44,000 acres of woodland purchased there in 1903 by the Diamond Match Company during the time that California was experiencing a really big boom just after World War I. A lot of families moving out here because of the economic opportunity. At first, I suspected that's what this had to do with. But yeah, so that's I'd have to get more information from my grandfather, but the sources are kind of, there's a lot of gray in that. So he grew up, unfortunately, at, when he was 9, that's not on this slide, but when he was 9, his brother died, and he said that was a really big transformative part in his life, even though he was a child. He said it drew him immediately toward the Lord, just having an experience of death. His brother died of tuberculosis, which is a pretty, to watch someone die that way is not, especially your brother, is pretty traumatic. So he remembers that during that day, he really started giving his heart to the Lord. He graduated from high school in Chico, and then entered a Bible school in San Francisco. But he talks about in his memoir, just growing up outside in Sterling City. It's a very wooded area. There's a lot of pine trees there, lots of very deep creeks, deep rivers. And he says that it was just like, it really influenced the way that he viewed God in a way, because for him, it was almost as if like he connected God mostly to nature, you know, when you grow up in an area like that, you can't help it. I've never been up there personally, but I definitely want to go up there. He's buried there this day in a small cemetery next to the church that he built there, which I'll show later on. That's a picture of him when he was a bishop. I'm not jumping ahead here, but he actually was a missionary to Argentina. That's a picture of him, who probably would have been out like 40 years old. But yeah, I believe that's on the Pampas. That's what, the plains in Argentina. So he, when he was in Bible school in San Francisco, he met what he called the love of his life, Shirley, my great grandmother. She died about 3 years after him, but it was kind of hard visiting her because you could visibly see that she missed him dearly. So in 1951, they were officially accepted as missionaries going to Argentina, and they took her and all 4 of their kids, including my grandpa, all down to Argentina, and that was really big transformative experience for him, because that's when he truly started to fall in love with Latin American studies. He was actually a professor of Latin American studies, got a doctorate in that and Latin American history as well, and taught that here at Vanguard when he came here in 1960. So then he came back, went back to Sacramento,
got his degree in theology at Sacramento State in 1959. And it's kind of funny because basically one of the faculty at Vanguard in 1960 just randomly reached out to him and said, hey, he had a connection to him. He's like, you want to come teach at Vanguard? And it's just, at that time it was Southern California College, I think, or might have been, yeah, it was SEC. But yeah, so basically the faculty member reached out to him and was going to teach at Vanguard. And, well, yeah, my family are looking for a bigger house. They were living in a small house while he was at grad school. But basically, he wanted to wait until he finished his actual degree, his bachelor's degree, until he started teaching. But he still moved his family down here regardless to Costa Mesa. I haven't been to the house specifically, but the house they lived at is still in Santa Ana. They live in several houses down here, but they finally settled in Costa Mesa, I believe on that side of the 55, going towards Back Bay. But I want to go find it someday. I just have to get my grandma to come here to remember where it is. So then in 1986, after he had retired from teaching, he ended up teaching at American River College in Sacramento after his brief stint at Vanguard. And he opened his own church called Grizzly Flats back in Sterling City. And it was a whole neighborhood up there, and he really just felt called by the Holy Spirit to build a church to minister to this community. He was actually a pastor of that church. And yeah, just like when I read, like, it really touched a lot of people up there, and it's a very powerful story just because, he really was like a man of the Lord. He committed his life to, obviously being a missionary to Argentina, and he ended his life, on the mission field, which is back where it all started. And I thought that was really touching to me in a way, because I think that it just shows, he's a man who really, from the beginning to end, just gave his life utterly to God. And I think that's why he's a role model for me, more than anything. Unfortunately though, in 2007, he passed away from old age. It was aggravated by Parkinson's. But yeah, I only actually ever met him once, actually twice. I really only remember once. Definitely wish I would have got to see him more, but it is what it is. So that's a map of where Sterling City is. As you can see, I don't know if anybody's from up there, that area, but it's pretty out in the middle of nowhere, out in the woods, deep in the Sierras. There's not a lot out there, but the whole area was built up during the mining boom and the logging boom during the early 20th century, before World War I and after. That's the church that he built, Grizzly Flats. By the way, he built that all by hand. Bought his own supplies, built the whole thing with him and his family. He built the entire thing from bottom up. So I thought that was pretty impressive. And then that's him and my great grandma Shirley, I think in 2003. But yeah, that's when they were older. And this is the poem that he would memorize from. He grew up during the Prohibition, which was 1921 to 33, was when Prohibition was a thing. And he had a very strong opinion on just substances in general, because he knew a lot of people whose lives were afflicted by this. But he wrote a poem, and I just thought I'd read this just because he memorized his entire poem. And this is just one part. The whole poem is like 3 pages long. But I just thought I'd read it because it kind of sums up, I guess, his strong moral ethics when it comes to being, I guess, in control of oneself. Believe me, when you hear a man is disparaging all laws, the end of which is triumph for the glorious temperance cause, oppose to prohibition, bound his object to destroy, placing gold at higher value than the safety of his boy. One who really fights for whiskey, I care not who he is. I'll tell you what, he'll change his mind if the boy it kills is his. Yeah, and these are my sources. Pretty short. Just introduces my grandma, my grandpa, my mom, and my grandpa's sisters and brothers, and there's an article about California history. But yeah, thank you very much for watching my presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Mendoza, and today I'm going to be talking a little about the life of my grandmother, Maria Delfina Mendoza. So within my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about who she was, her immigration story, the impact that the Chicano movement had on her life, and just some of the memories I had. So who was Maria Delfina Mendoza? So Maria Delfina Castillo at the time was a daughter to a Polish immigrant father and a native Guatemalan mother she was born in Santa Rosa de Lima, Guatemala on September 27, 1936. She was the second oldest daughter of 8 children. She had 2 brothers and 5 sisters. She did grow up in a military household where her father was a lieutenant colonel in the Guatemalan army, so she did grow up in a really military structured home. I can only imagine how she kind of had to maintain these certain expectations growing up. And since she was the second oldest and the first daughter of the family, she had this expectation of maintaining the family image and taking care of her siblings throughout her life. So growing up, she really didn't have a childhood the way that her siblings had. She had to grow up a lot faster and be a lot more mature. And now into her immigration story. My grandmother immigrated from Guatemala to New York, in 1961 at the age of 25. She did arrive with a tourist visa. She did come alone, so she did leave her family behind in Guatemala. Upon arriving to New York, on her second night here, she met a beloved woman that opened the doors to her home and allowed my grandmother to stay. And that young woman ended up becoming really good friends with my grandmother while she stayed in New York for about 8 years. That very friend introduced my grandmother to the sewing industry. So my grandmother was able to pick up the basic skills needed to become a seamstress. She worked in some sewing factories, and then by 1969, my grandmother moved down to Boyle Heights, California, which is down in East Los Angeles, and she ended up getting a job in the sewing factory down here as well. So she brought the skills that she learned in New York down to Los Angeles, and eventually she became a personal seamstress to the wealthy. So she would kind of make clothes for them, tailor suits for the men, and then by 1970, she would meet her husband, Fernando Montana, which could be seen in these images, and then they later on married about a year later, and in 1975, she would have her first and only child, my dad, Franklin Mendoza Castillo. So in these pictures are just pictures of her and her husband, and then my father as a baby in his early years, and then around his 20s. So kind of now going on to the impact of the Chicano movement. So throughout the 1960s and 70s, it was a very pivotal moment for the Mexican community. During this time, many Mexican and Mexican Americans would face discrimination, racism, and kind of would receive mistreatment. And as well, during this time period, many Central Americans would immigrate to the United States during this time period. So when they would arrive to the United States, they will often be mistaken for being Mexican, for either just having similar complexions or just for speaking Spanish. And this took a toll on my grandmother as well, as she lived during that time, because she would often be discriminated against within the workforce. She would also sometimes face racism for just speaking Spanish alone. So you could only imagine how many Hispanics and Chicanos faced that same story as well. And then one of my articles that I chose was The Many Narratives of Growing Up with Central American Roots by Alejandra Molina. She shares several testimonies of many Central Americans during the time of the Chicano movement. And many of the Central Americans during that time also emphasize how they were often discriminated against, or that they would sometimes feel like they didn't know who they were since they were often mistaken for being Mexican. And a majority of them eventually just said that they were Mexican because they were tired of having to explain that they were actually Central American, that they were either Salvadoran, Guatemalan, or from Nicaragua. And then some quick memories about her. Growing up, I knew my grandmother as a God-fearing woman. She was an amazing grandmother. Oftentimes, me and my sister would spend time down here for the summer for about 3 months. We would, it would mainly be my older sister and I, so we would have these amazing memories with her. We would go down to Hollywood, we would go down to the sewing factories that she worked with, and she didn't leave behind much, but what she did leave behind was her love, many memories, and several characteristics that I see to this day within my sisters, my mom, and especially my dad. And so to finally wrap this up before I get more emotional, this was a saying that she used to tell every single person, especially us, before departing. she would say, no les digo adios, les digo hasta pronto, which translates into, I won't say goodbye, but I'll see you soon. And then this is just some of my sources that I've used within my paper. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, hi, my name is Grayson Young, and today I am going to present on my great grandmother, or my great grandmother. So I named my paper and my presentation, The Midnight Train to California, kind of like a little play on like the Midnight Train to Georgia, just because they did come from the South, and it is quite the experience. And it is the life of a woman that demanded more for her legacy. Cool. So introducing Clarice Perry. This is my great grandmother, and Clarice Perry is my great grandmother, and she is more than an ordinary figure to me. She has been one of the most extraordinary women in my life, and she has forefronted a path in which that I have left no choice but to follow her values. I will always love selflessly and will give back no matter how much I have. Cool. So who is Clarice Perry? I recently found out that she is one of 18. I was not one to meet all 18. I think I met about 9 of them, which was a lot in itself. I'm very much a representation of them myself. So if you know me, you know that I talk a lot and I am very expressive and I just go with the flow and like I just kind of make things happen. So if you can imagine older versions of me and they came from the South and they have accents and they do a lot. So that is my family, and she is one of only of a twin in her family, which is kind of fun, very exciting. I never was able to meet her twin brother, but I've heard a lot about him, and if they're anything alike, then there's enough that I only met one. And she was a loving mother. Her heart was gracefully and evenly shared over her 9 children, which is my grandma and her sisters and brothers, which is also, again, very exciting. And then she was also a God-fearing woman. She devoted her life to the Lord and never looked back. And within her story, you will tell that religion is a very big thing in our family, and we take it everywhere we go. And you can tell by a lot of the acts that we do and a lot of the things that are important in our life. So you'll see that throughout her legacy and what she instilled in my family, basically. So this is a portrait of her. And Clarice migrated from Wewoka, Oklahoma in the mid-1900s and traveled to California during a very popular time in migration, which I'll get into a little bit more coming up. But she traveled to Linnell Camp. If you know anything about the Central Valley, it's kind of close to like Tepeston, Tulare, California. Very much, there's not much there. And there wasn't much there when she got there, so I can imagine like what they were really working. And then they ended up migrating around the Central Valley and placed themselves in Tepeston, Delano, and then finally landed in Tulare, California, which is where my family's from. Okay, so where was she? Where is Wewoka, Oklahoma? This is a city located in Seminole County in East Central Oklahoma. One very exciting, interesting fact that I wasn't very aware of is the fact that these are small towns that were very specific to like races and stuff like that. So this one happened to be founded by the U.S. and cultivated and created by the offspring of African Americans and Creek Indians. If you can imagine, 1843, and she was born in 1931. So the tension and the high like segregation and everything going on, they built their own communities to kind of stray away from that, if you will. So Wewoka, Oklahoma is one of those, and they, I wouldn't say lived a great life, but they lived a life that was very successful for them. They were very happy, and they chose to take the good things out of it, which I found very like surprising, just because I have a lot of like first world problems. So I know like if something goes wrong with me, I'm like, yeah. But I can only imagine something going wrong during like your Dust Bowl and like during like segregated times and stuff like that. So it's kind of like taking a step back and really like, okay, it's not that bad. Anytime I have a problem. All right, so introduction, what was going on at the time? All right, so some major moments that were going on would be the Great Depression and Dust Bowl. I'm pretty sure that these aren't unfamiliar. to all of us in the room. The Great Depression hit in Oklahoma harder than any other state at the time. The Great Depression was caused by a combination of economic issues and bad luck, and kept Oklahoma in a state of unknown. People were tasked with providing for their families with resources that were limited, and self-agriculture was relied on very heavily. And then we had the Dust Bowl, right? So at the time where you were relying on agriculture to really feed your family and get you through everything that you needed to, Dust Bowl comes in and you really can't grow anything. So we had dry weather, and it began in like the early 1930s, so the year she was born basically, and persisted through the early 1940s for some areas, and peaked during the years of 1934 and 36. This occurred simultaneously with the Great Depression and called for a serious setback in the livelihood of those who lived in Oklahoma, which happened to be my great-grandmother and her 18 siblings and her mom and dad. And she's a family of like 20, so you can imagine like feeding a family of 20. I can imagine feeding myself in that time. So I think 20 would just be really pushing it. All right, so hindsight is 1946. Let's go ahead and set the scene. It is 18 siblings stuck in the middle of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and they are forced to find a way to make it work. At that time, you don't really get to sit and just mope in the experience that you're going through. And I find that my great-grandma did not do that at all after researching a lot of the things that she has done, which is very surprising, but not really. At the end of the day, if you knew who she was, then you'd be like, okay, that makes sense. And then migration to California is the best option in order to make a living and a family. So in order for her to continue her legacy, she knew that she had to get out of Oklahoma, and that is something that she did, and she did it very well. California has work to be done, and you can't stop with yourself. You must lead everyone on the way. So she was part of a group of people that were moving African Americans in that section of Oklahoma to California. So she didn't just go to California and was like, okay, cool, I got it figured out, thank you very much. She went back and made sure that she was taking the people from her community back to California so they could start their families in a much more sustainable area, which is very commendable. And one of the most important things that we did find is that we must have the faith of a mustard seed and find the Lord within all situations. There is not one day that I do not remember my grandma being or my great-grandma being very, very religious. Every Sunday is like a very traditional Baptist type vibe. I do have a video to show you kind of like what it was like. But if you can imagine like a Baptist church in the South, it's like you go to church and you wear your Sunday best. So it's like me in like dresses and heels, and like my grandma in dresses and heels, and like we're all matching on Easter and Christmas and like every other holiday. So it's just little stuff like that, but they very much instilled like you do the Bible studies, you do the Sundays, and you do them big. That is not a day that you take lightly, and it is a day of rest for the Lord. So that is something that is instilled in me, and it was very, very big for her. Cool. So basic tools for mental survival, the Bible, right? Clarice used the Bible as one of her safe havens. She could confidently give you a Bible verse at the drop of a dime, which was very fun, and at the same time it was kind of like, okay, I'm over it. But it was very nice now that I am 21 and I use it like throughout my everyday life to see like where she was really at. And then her undenying faith, her faith was strong throughout her years, and there was a reason that she took us so seriously. There was no way that she could be brought out of all of her situations without him, which when looking back over all the things that she has gone through, knowing her in my about like 16 years of knowing her, I would have never known that she went through a lot of the experiences that she did. And even when getting them from family members and like her brothers and stuff like that, it was very like evident, and like the fact that I didn't know much about what she had gone through, because of the way she was so happy with God and how you would never know that she had gone through a lot of the stuff that she did. So elements of life, these are her children, right? So this is basically naming it. And then we have her grandchildren, right? So that is another like section. And then her great grandchildren, there are about 30 of us. And we have had the pleasure of watching her grow up, or her watching us grow up. And really just like taking in and embracing everything that she has been taught, And then on top of that, moving forward with it and instilling it in our own lives. She passed in 2016, so that's a good amount of time. I was born in 2002, so it's about 14 years of listening to her and what she has to say, and the little things that I really got to pick up on myself when I had my like one-on-one time with her, like the time grows, just all the generations together. I have a lot of women in my family, so it's really nice to just be around them and really like watch them dive into the word. Cool. And then my process will include relationship. Right, so this is gonna be Starling Beavers, which is the love of life. That is my great grandfather. I've never had the chance to really meet him. He died earlier on, but she never did not talk about him. And we have my family ties, which is her immediate extended family, and then I have my religion, which is something that really drives me and pushes me past a lot of the things that I went through and what she went through. And then we have Oklahoma, so the major events that we are talking about. I have my real accounts, which are the people who were able to grow up with her and grow up around her, which are like her brothers. I think about 3 of them are living, and they happen to call my grandma every day. They never skip a day, and it's usually at 7 in the morning. So they were more than happy to share their story, and it is, honestly, they made it super easy. They keep accounts of everything. And then her legacy, so the parts of her life that directly touch my heart, and the way she shines through each and every one of my elders. Cool, and then I have a little quote because it just made me think about my whole thing. And it says, what is a legacy? And it's planting seeds in a garden that you never get to see. And I think that that is a great way to explain her and her process of life. Cool. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley, and I just want to thank all of you for coming out today to watch our presentation. So I am writing my paper about my great grandma and her life. She lived 100 years, so I am going to try to keep my presentation short. There's a lot of ground to cover, but I'm going to do my best to shorten it. So the title of my paper is A Life Worth Living, The Extraordinary Life of Anna Kurbatovna, and it will eventually become Kitchell. So my paper is kind of everything a little sporadic. I haven't placed any of her story into the paper yet, but I have done the research for it. So I'm going to talk about her life, her early life, her childhood, and like where her family came from. And then I'm going to be talking about what she did in life, and then her life kind of living through a century since she lived for a really long time. And then just what her lasting impact has been on our family, and then my memories and stuff that I have with her. So something that she always used to say, our family has a very strong generational tie to just believing in faith, like believing in Jesus and having faith. And so she always used to say, I know nothing but a life of Christ. So who was Anna Yermevna Kurbatovna? She was a child of Russian Molokhan immigrants. And I had to add the Molokhan part in because Molokhan immigrants, they tended to differentiate themselves from like Russian immigrants, even though they were Russian immigrants. So the Molokhan, it's a church actually, and the church means milk drinkers, which is kind of funny. And they also consider themselves to be different from the Russian Orthodox Church. So they're like a sect of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it's kind of a combination, my uncle said, of Protestant Baptist, which is really funny. You don't hear those two kind of things put together. We tend to separate and differentiate those two things in America. It also, they call themselves the Holy Spirit jumpers of Christ. So Anna Yermevna Kurbatovna, she was born in Glendale, Arizona on September 6th in 1917. Now, the registrar that came to the office, like he went to the house to record her birthday, he actually wrote the date that he visited and not her actual birth date. So we always celebrated 2 birthdays for her. And sometimes we would, differentiate over the years, like, oh, we'll do the 6th this year, oh, we'll do the 12th this year. So we would go back and forth. Her parents' names were Yerme and Marina Kurbatov, or Jeremiah and Mary. And little cute side story, her parents only knew each other for a week before they were married. So he went knocking on the door. And she was the 5th child out of 8 children. There was tragedy in her childhood. She lost her youngest sister And she didn't know, I believe Johnny was his name. He passed away in infancy and he was born between the first and second children. So 2 children out of 8, unfortunately, were lost. And this is her standing next to Grandpa Curvatop. This is her mama, Grandma Curvatop, her sister Margaret, and I believe that's Aunt Mary. All right, and then just a little context. This is her in later years, and then this is James, my uncle. This is my grandma Louise and my Aunt Linda. Her husband Ralph, her brother Pete, his kids, their uncle, I don't know his name, his wife. That's Grandpa Curvatop, Grandma Curvatop, Uncle Bill, his wife, Aunt Mary with her husband, Aunt Jean with her son and Margaret. And also a little cultural thing about Russian marriages and families, the woman never actually takes the husband's last name. It's really fascinating, but the husband gives his last name to the children. So one thing that I did ask about when I was interviewing my grandma and my uncle, do we know if Mary actually took Grandpa Curvatop's last name? But we don't know, so she probably had her own last name, Rhythmukin. So, but that was her family, of course, in later life. I believe they were having Thanksgiving. All right, so what did she do? So she was a woman who worked up until retirement. So her first job was as a nanny, and she was able to maintain that job like through the Great Depression. And it wasn't until I believe the mid-30s that she ended up moving to Cudahy's meat packing factory. And that's where she worked. And while she worked with Lena, that is who she met her husband, Ralph. And another little fun fact is in the Molokhan tradition, you weren't allowed to date or marry anyone who wasn't within the church community. And so that was kind of like a big adverse like thing for her where she was like, you know, I'm not really interested. And I don't think that we can be together. And also, you know, at the time he had already been married. Ralph was married once before and had a child. And so it was really extra like, you know, I don't think I'm interested, but he was very, very pursuant and he was persistent. And so they got married in 1942 and she was excommunicated from the Russian Molokhan church. So she isn't buried in the Russian Molokhan church the way that the rest of her family is. So she's married next to my great grandpa in the Oakdale Cemetery in Glendora. But in 1943, she gave birth to my grandma, Louise Marie Kitchell. And then in 1946, she gave birth to James Lawrence Kitchell. In 1949 to Linda Jean Kitchell. And in 1952 to Jeremiah Ray Kitchell. And a little fun story about that is right after they got married, my great grandpa, he was drafted into World War II. So he left with no idea that she was pregnant with their first child, and he was gone for 3 years. So when he came back, he had a 3-year-old child, and she did not like him. My grandma remembers that she didn't like him because she was like, who is this guy in my house with my mother? And then again, that's her up at the top, and I believe that that is my Aunt Linda at the bottom, and then there she is with her sister Margaret. And then here's family pictures of them. So that's my grandpa and my grandma, and then with their 3 children. Jeremiah was just a twinkle in the sky in the top middle picture still. And there they are, I believe, right after they had gotten married. And then here they are in their older years, and then with their 4 kids right here. So this is my Uncle Jim, my Aunt Linda, Papa, Mama, Uncle Jerry, and Aunt Louise, Grandma Louise. All right, so I know I kind of touched stuff about the Great Depression and World War II. So she lived through many, many, many happenings. And she actually always did say that she wanted to live 100 years, which I mean, I think that's really, really long to want to live, personally. But, you know, she was able to maintain work through the Great Depression. It wasn't like they completely struggled. And then in World War II, I mean, obviously, most women enter the workforce. And I think in one of the sources I read that was like the highest number of women actually entering the workforce because they had to. All the men had been drafted and were gone. And through the 50s, she did take some time off. You know, there was that stigma of, you know, women had to stay home, take care of the children and be the homemakers. But she did take time off because she had 4 children. So it made sense for her to take time off. But my papa, he was very, very supportive of her, and he never ever told her like, oh, no, you can't work, like, you're a woman, your place is in the house. So he said, no, when you're ready to go back to work, go to work. And he was really happy to pick up the slack. And I believe, talking to my uncle, he took on like 2 jobs until she was ready to go back to work. And he worked for the railroad company, and she just had various jobs. She worked at a pharmaceutical company. I think it was Resflex, and then she moved on to work at Kenmore. And then she worked out of school, so she was kind of a jack of all trades. She didn't really stick to one thing. And then, you know, again, there was a lot of stuff in the 60s. We're gonna bypass all of that, but then in the 70s, she retired in 1973. And the 70s, she saw the birth of her first two grandchildren, so my aunt and my mom. And my mom always said that it was always her picking them up from school and dropping them off, so she didn't remember when she retired, but turns out she was retired almost her whole life. So, and then I wanted to just show you guys some pictures. So that's my papa, and he was drafted with one of his friends. Just my mama's signature, and her signature, like a payment book, and she went to go pick up something from Fresno Drug. And then the 70s, her family, so like my mom, my aunt, everybody's in there. So what has her lasting impact been on our family? It has been living a life of faith, honestly. You know, she did grow up in the Russian Molokan church, so already generationally, they brought that over from Russia for us. And I mean, there wasn't a time that she wasn't quoting scripture to you. She can quote the Bible like it was the back of her own hand. And I mean, I'm really appreciative of that because I've been able to grow up in church. My mom grew up in church, my grandma grew up in church, and then mama, she grew up in church too. Yeah, so that's been one of her lasting impacts. And also she was a big fighter. So okay, really quick. So funny story, a lot of the tragedy that she had in her youth really caused her she had to have tough skin because she was Russian and they were labeled as communists. I mean, there's a story where there was graffiti on the sidewalk in front of the house and they had come and they washed it off, but they didn't completely get some of the lettering off. And Grandpa Kurbatov told them, we're not gonna wash it off, we're gonna walk over it. And the reason why it's gonna get washed off is because our feet walking over it is gonna erase it. And so he told them, like, we gotta be tough nuts and we're just gonna get through this, and by the grace and the power of the Holy Spirit, we will go. And so, again, it's just been a constant story of faith into our family and integrated. And then, I know, I'm sorry, I'm going a little over, but my memories, I have a lot. That's me as a baby up there. And then that's me as an adult. I really wanted that blue Cadillac. I thought that was gonna be my first car. I spent so many summers sitting in the middle seat between her and Papa. We would go to IHOP and get hot cakes. She called jingle and pancakes. They were hot cakes. And I really thought, I'm gonna get this car, but then they sold it one day and I was really sad. But she inspired me. There's a lot of things in my life that I like to do now that she just really inspired me to do. I love to write. She encouraged me to write. There wasn't a summer or a time when I went after going to the doctor that we were at her house and I was writing her letters, and we would sit out at night and we would stare up at the stars. So if I wasn't a history and poli-sci major, I think I'd probably be doing something in astronomy, but there's too much math there. But I have very, very dear and fond memories of her. And I love spending time with her. I loved talking to her. I mean, so much of my sources have just been the fact that I spent so much time with her as a baby and just growing up. And then oral tradition through my grandma, through my uncles, through my aunt, and then through my mom and my aunt. So it's just been a long line of some good stuff. And so that's pretty much it. But she truly lived a life worth living.
Guys, mine will be quick. But, my interview focuses on one person, but then Jimenez told me to just throw a family tree in there, so I threw it in there. So, kind of what my paper will cover first, There's a brief outline. Second is background. Third is the interview with my cousin. And lastly will be the research and sources that I did. So this is kind of like the mini outline that I just threw in here. So the main theme was how my family with its military preparedness made its mark in history. And my small outline, start with the family tree, just go who's who and how they relate to the military, how they relate to me personally. And then like the second part will be the history of the person and how they relate to the bigger picture of history. So the first person I wanted to kind of highlight my background is my father. He was in the Army. He was deployed to Iraq in 2003 and 2004. He was involved in a tanker crew, which I want to say M1A1 or M1 Abrams, something like that. He has severe PTSD, and when he got home, my uncle thought that it would be funny to light a firecracker and throw it at him, and he actually dove under the closest car. So he produced 2 sons in the military. One was my brother, Colby Lindsay, and the other is Cody Lawless, who he was just always around, so we just called him my brother. And he was actually in the unit that found Saddam Hussein. So the next one is my cousin, Joey. He was in the Army. He was in the infantry, or Crunchies, as my dad called them. He was in Afghanistan and Iraq. He concluded 4 tours between Afghanistan and Iraq. The next one, who my paper is mostly about, is my cousin Wyatt. He was a Marine. He was deployed in Kabul, Afghanistan. He was assigned to a special task force, and he received a Bronze Star with a V for his actions. The next one is Joe Smith. He's a close family friend. He was in the Air Force, World War II. He is actually turning 102 in August. He flew over the coastal waters off of Florida looking for enemy submarines, and you can see the picture of him there. The next one is my papa. He was in the Army in the Vietnam War, and he was a helicopter door gunner in Vietnam. And he was shot in the knee and caught shrapnel in the back that punctured his lungs. And thank goodness he survived, because we're like best friends now. And the next person is my great grandfather. He was in the Army, a tech sergeant. He was in World War II in New Guinea, and his brother, James Otis Watkins, was wounded going ashore in Normandy. And I forgot a picture of him. And this is my father closest to me. The one in the middle is Colby, my brother. And then the one furthest from me is Cody, which is also my brother. This was my uncle. The one in the middle is my papa. And the one furthest from me is my cousin Renee. He is currently active duty and stationed at Fort Drum in New York. This is my uncle, Jesse Watkins Jr., who passed away recently. The next one, who I find just really cool, John Adams, who was my grand uncle. He did 4 years in the Marines, got out for a couple months, then went back to do a total of 29 years in the Army for a total of 33 to 34 years of service before he retired. While in the service, one of his cooler jobs that I like to say is that he escorted some of the soldiers from Hitler's regime while they were being tried for war crimes. And the main, I'm gonna say like the meat of my paper is about Wyatt Wilson. And I just wanted to kind of throw the interview in here. He was sent into the ball after the Taliban captured the city on August 15th. He was assigned to a special group which was tasked with keeping the crowds from storming the airport and watching the crowd for suicide bombers. The airport gate that they were protecting had little to no protection, and the Marines knew that they could be attacked at any minute. I asked my cousin how he felt about that, And he says, I remember sitting there having no clue how it was going to work, but he just pushed on and kept compartmentalizing. Unfortunately, a suicide bomber was able to get through undetected, and he was only 32 feet away from the bomb and was thrown into the air and sprayed with shrapnel throughout his body. He had surgery to repair his jaw and required both a tracheal tube and chest tube for internal bleeding. His jaw was wired shut after the surgeries to make sure everything would heal correctly. The extent of his injuries were facial and chest trauma and multiple shrapnel wounds throughout his abdomen and extremities. He received a Bronze Star for a few of his actions after the blast, and some of my resources, the personal interview, many years of oral history throughout the family, multiple papers I have written in the past few years, Purple Heart speech, why the VA hospital doesn't help veterans, because my father is, with his severe PTSD, he's, was put onto medication and they keep changing it and nothing seems to be happening. I wrote a paper on suicide rates within the veteran community and how high it is. I also did a research project on ICK and prior knowledge due to being in a military family that goes on many generations, and my